Yo, yo, yo. Hey guys, welcome back to another awesome edition of the Best Practices Show podcast. You ever thought about your practice and thinking, what am I building here? What business model am I creating? And what you're going to hear today is not all business models are equal. What you have to do as a dentist is you got to figure out who you want to be, what business model do you want to create, and then how do you make it happen? And I've got our CEO, Dr. Barrett Straub, on today. Thanks for being on, brother.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
Now, this is an awesome, awesome podcast. I'm going to say this to the listeners. You guys don't know this, but this man worked his tail off for several months to prepare this quarter's content for our To the Top Study Club. And there's a ton that we're going to cover in the next couple of weeks. But one of the things that we are making all of the members of the To the Top Study Club do is think about their business model. Can you talk about the why behind this?
Yeah, the business model is so important. And really where it came from is the history of dentistry is to take a big page of KPIs or data, metrics, follow them, and then make decisions. But very few dentists knew what the data points were actually measuring, why they were measuring them, and if they weren't meeting benchmarks, what to do about it.
Right.
And so if you've been a listener to this podcast, if you've been in our community, you are well aware of our financial gaps model. This is like the next layer.
Yeah.
If we use the financial gaps as our foundation for data, for performance measuring in our practice, then every KPI or every data point should really fit in a gap.
Right.
And the gaps and, some of the tales we're going to tell today kind of tell a story about how, if you're a dentist at home listening, we're going to teach you how to assess your practice and answer some questions that maybe you never even thought about. One, which business model am I in? Am I efficiently producing dentistry?
Right.
And then ideally, where do I want to go in the future? Do I want to move to this side of the spectrum or this side of the spectrum, and know that there's different strategies necessary for each?
Yeah. So let's talk about that spectrum that you just mentioned. You can be in high profit margin or low profit margin. And then you can also incorporate volume in there. Can you explain that?
Yeah, we're going to talk about that. But if you just think about business, if you and I were going to set up shop and make widgets, we would be intentional about knowing what's our profit margin. When I produce a widget and I sell it for X, how much profit am I going to get?
Right.
Every business does that except dentistry.
Right.
And maybe healthcare to some regard. But dentistry, very few dentists know what their profit margin. And if you're listening, I'll say this, it's not the difference between your overhead.
Right.
Overhead is part of the equation, but only part of it. So one, we want to know, what is our profit margin? Do we have a high profit margin or low profit margin? And there's some data points that'll help us tell that. And we're going to talk about one of my favorites today.
Yeah.
That's annual patient value.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't you open us up? What is an annual patient value? We just talked about it with all our clients last week, and it's fast becoming my go-to KPI.
Yeah, I love that. And on KPIs, can I do this first? Is it okay?
Yeah.
I just want to give you some perspective. When you're talking about low margins, high volume, these are practices typically writing off somewhere around 30%, type of a thing. When you're looking at high margins, low volume, you're looking at practices that are writing off less than 10%. Mm-hmm. Low margins, high volume, you're looking at annual patient value, which we're going to talk about in a second. So bookmark this, right around $200-$300. And then you're looking at high margin, low volume, north of $1,000 annual patient value. Then you've got PPV, which we'll talk about, which is, somewhere in the $100 mark. And then you're looking at $700 mark, which we'll explain. And then we're going to talk about active patients, in low margin, high volume practices. we see some dentists that need 2,000, 3,000 patients because their APV is so low, annual patient value.
Yeah.
And you just need the volume. And then we see a lot of dentists that come here, they sit right in this room. They don't need that many patients. They only need 1,000 patients or 1,100 patients. So what I want you to do, if you're listening, is just bookmark that for a second. And that's what we mean by deciding what kind of business model. Do you want to just ramp it up with a lot of patients? And think about that in this whole process. Now, annual patient value is a great indicator of where you are on the map. Can you explain what it is?
Yeah. So annual patient value, how you calculate it is your collections divided by your active patients. And we define an active patient as they have had a visit in your practice in the last 18 months. So if you were calculating your APV or annual patient value for the year of 2023, you would take your collections or your revenue and divide it by your active patient count on December 31st.
Yes.
And that's going to give out a dollar value. On one end, on the low end, you will be, $100, $200, $300. On the high end, over $1,000, even as high as $1,500. Those are kind of the more extreme numbers that we see on either side of the high profit margin, low profit margin spectrum.
Right. And so what would create a practice that has an annual patient value of $300? Give me some characteristics.
So APV, well, let's back up. APV is one of our favorites, and because it tells us a bunch of things, but it tells us four very important things. One, it tells us how you produced your gross production.
Yeah.
How you got to your gross production. We can have two practices, each producing $1 million. And they can get there in very different ways. So one practice might do a lot of dentistry on a small amount of patients.
Right.
The other practice might do a little bit of dentistry on a ton of patients. One will have a high APV, one will have a low APV, and at the end of the day, they still got to that same $1 million.
Yeah.
But their days look different.
Right.
Their practices operate differently. Their stress levels, their time margin, their energy gap, we call it, is different. And APV tells us. So it's going to tell us how busy your days are. It's going to tell us the level of comprehensiveness of your dentistry. A low APV, $100-$200, that usually indicates 1 to 2 tooth dentistry.
Right.
$1,000 and more usually indicates more comprehensive full quad, full arch dentistry. Just not right or wrong, just the level of comprehensive.
Right.
It also tells you how many patients you need for your business to reach your desired level of profitability.
Right.
So let's go back to the profit margin, high profit margin, low profit margin. If you have a low profit margin, so you only profit a little bit on your dentistry per patient, what's the only way you can make more money?
Just volume.
Just do more.
Yeah.
Okay. What if your chairs are already full? What if you're already busy and you have a low profit margin? You're like, I need more.
Yeah.
What do? You
just, now we got to expand.
Right. Now we need more hours.
Or I need a second practice.
Yeah. You need more hours, more chairs, more providers, more days, sometimes more practices. And it's sometimes because that's what you want, but most of the time it's a increase in capacity only because of this internal need of like, I'm not making a lot of money on my dentistry, so I got to do more and more and more and more. It's the only way.
Right.
But what most dentists don't do is say, what if I increase my profit margin?
Yeah.
So I can make more on the same volume or even make more on less volume.
Now go back to the profit margin thing, because the first thing that most dentists think about when increasing profit margin is, I got to find cheaper supplies.
Right.
Or I got to take a look at wages.
Right.
So they try to cut to make more profit. What's the fundamental problem with that?
What we have found is a fundamental problem and not in a low profit margin usually doesn't have to do with your overhead.
What? What are you saying?
I know it's counterintuitive. Yeah. It has to do with your effort gap or the amount that you are writing off or adjusting due to insurance and the lack of collections, not collecting 100% of your net production. You add those two together And that is where your profit margin usually went.
Yeah. So if you're a dentist listening, we're going to help you out of this. But here is the challenge. You've said it before many times. Gross production is one of the worst numbers ever.
Yes.
Because somebody could be producing $3 million, but writing off 42% of it.
Right.
And their overhead's 80%. And so it's not apples to apples.
Right.
You know, you hear all these reports about the average overhead being 71%. Well, there's so many more questions to ask.
Right.
And you're right, it has very little to do with what they're spending, because most dentists are paying attention, or they have an accountant or a bookkeeper that's saying, hey, look, we're spending a lot of money for this.
Right.
So
some generalities we are seeing as we assess practices are, if usually practices with a low APV, with a low annual patient value, have a low profit margin.
Yeah.
It's paired with higher volume. They're moving fast. They're churning and burning.
Right.
Right. And it often is attributed with a bigger write-off, more adjustments, because that's the model that they're in. That's what's giving them that low profit margin. And they're adding capacity, thinking that they need to, quote unquote, do more, produce more, only to find that their increase in profitability isn't nearly what they thought. We are also finding doctors that are managing, intentionally looking at their profit margin, adjusting their adjustments so that they can profit, looking at the volume, looking at the days, looking at how hard they want to work each day, are able to find that magic balance.
Yeah.
Better practice, better life.
Better practice, better life. And two, some things that we don't talk about a lot when it comes to data is mindset. A lot of the dentists that we find that have an APV of $300, that number is a challenge, but really there's a ceiling in their brain around, well, my patients would never pay for dentistry.
Right.
You don't understand. Most of my patients are on these PPOs.
Right.
And it's funny, but it's not funny. One of the internal jokes that we have, or, dialogues that we have, is when a coach will take a look at the APV, they'll see it really high and they'll go, I already know this is a dentist that does comprehensive dentistry, right?
Yeah. I mean, APV alone tells us so much more. And in a second, we're going to go through two little scenarios. But if you combine APV with percentage of write-offs, with simply the number of active patients your practice has, those three metrics alone, we can pretty much assess your practice.
Yeah.
And pretty much tell you how stressed you are each day.
Right.
And pretty much tell you kind of what's waking you up at night.
Yeah. And so you could do this too if you're just driving. Let's start with the patient thing.
Yeah.
A lot of times you listen to a podcast and somebody says, well, I have 4,500 patients.
Right.
The reality of most dentists, let's just consider your practice a one doctor practice. Mm-hmm. You really only need about 1,500 patients, max.
Max.
The better you are, the less you have. So let's start there.
That's a great point. So APV tells you how efficient you are getting to your gross production. Built into the APV calculation is basically a question saying, how many patients do you need to get to that $1 million?
Right.
Do you need 1,100? We have some great fee-for-service practices that have like 950 and producing a ton.
Yeah.
Or do you need 2,200 to get to that $1 million? Now, we're going to show you two different practices with grossly varying active patients. These are like based off real practices, so we're not just making it up.
Let's do it.
And so let's just say, because this will do a better job of painting the picture. So let's say we have two practices. Practice one collects. We won't even go into production and adjustments and collections. We're just going to say revenue. Well, we will next time. Okay. Let's just say we got two practices. They both collect $1.5 million.
Right.
Pretty good practices.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. One has $652 APV.
Okay.
The practice two has $1,153. So $600 and $1,100 APV. Both collect $1.5 million. So what that tells us is the one with lower APV, they need 2,300 patients to get to 1.5.
Yep.
Practice 2 needs only 1,300 to get to 1.5.
Yeah.
Now, notice that I'm not even saying a $300 APV, which we see all the time. 652 is like right in the middle of the spectrum. It's not bad at all.
Yeah.
It's showing that they're moving towards that comprehensive. Over $1,000 tells us that they're differentiated, that people are choosing their dentistry, that they're able to diagnose, present, sell, deliver dentistry.
Yep.
But if both these two practices, now knowing these numbers, what can we draw? What conclusions can we draw? Well, one, let's just assume that they work the same amount of days.
Right.
That practice one needs to see 43% more patients per day to get to 1.5.
That's a lot.
That's probably not possible. So what is going to have to happen for practice one?
You're going to have to somehow open up potential.
Yeah. They're gonna
somehow, some way.
They're going to work more days, first of all.
More days, more hours, and more chairs. Yeah.
So they're going to be more complex. They're going to work harder. They're going to do less dentistry on more patients. They're going to be busier. The volume is going to be going faster because they have a smaller profit margin. They've got to turn that wheel faster and more often to spit out the same revenue.
Right.
They're less efficient in their production.
Mm-hmm.
The higher APV is saying I can get to 1.5 million in revenue on only 1,300 patients. I'm highly efficient. Now, the efficiency we're talking about is we're going to do and collect more dentistry on each patient.
Right.
It's business. It's economics 101.
Right.
High profit margin, low volume. They pair together.
Right.
Low profit margin, high volume.
Yeah.
Those are the extremes. They just automatically go together. Why? Because if you're low profit margin and low volume, you cease to exist as a business.
Yep.
Okay. So over time, all low profit margins pair with high volume because it's the only way to make more money.
Yeah.
Now, if you have a high profit margin, the beauty is now you can intentionally control your volume. How busy do you want to be? When do you want to see certain procedures? What do you want your days to look like? We love how many days do you want to work?
Yeah.
Let's design an amazing life by working only the amount of days you want to work.
And the hours that you want to work,
Right.
and the type of patients you want to see. Now, what's really the coolest part about this is a podcast, and we've been talking a lot about money.
Yeah.
And we spend a lot of time. I would consider us the experts. I'm not one to say that,
Right.
but we spend so much time with some excellent practices here. We've been talking a lot about money, but what you're going to find with these practices that have an APV of 1,153, they're not focused on money all day long. They're working on things like core values, like communication, like culture. The practices that are struggling to keep their APV or it's a lower APV, it's all about we got to produce. Right. We got to produce to pay bills. And so that's another question you have to ask as a dentist is where's your focus?
Right.
I want my focus to be on quality relationships, finding the right type of patient. You're also probably, this is a general, you're going to be spending more time with patients. You're going to be learning more about them. You're going to be coming up with more comprehensive solutions. There's a higher level of intimacy with these patients, so.
That's a great point because if you only need to see 1,300 to get to your desired revenue, you just have more time to spend with them. What
Right.
does more time equate to? It equates to better patient satisfaction. It equates to better diagnosis. It equates to just more time for treatment presentation, which then results in better treatment acceptance.
Right.
And then you have more time to do the work.
Right.
Which is always nice.
Yeah.
None of us want to feel pressured under a time to get work done.
Yeah. That's one of my biggest pet peeves is when I got to go to this place and this place and this place. And you can't even go to the bathroom. So, part of any business or being a dentist is just figuring out who you are and how you want to experience yourself on a daily basis. And by taking a look at this, you can actually, there are dials that you can play with. Maybe you have a 652 APV and you're like, okay, well, this makes sense. I have kids that are teenage years. I don't want to work as hard. And maybe let's get better at this and really start to understand the numbers so that we can decide how hard we want to work. I don't want to put this effort and have it be for free.
Right. Because if your APV is higher, you can see less patients, less time.
Right.
If your APV is very low, you need to see a lot of patients. So our friends at Dental Intel have given us their benchmarks. And so APV, the average nationwide is $644. It's right in the middle.
Yeah.
The bottom 10% is $370 and the top 10% is over $1,100. So I also like APV as a diagnostic marker for a practice who wants to lower their insurance dependence.
Yeah.
So if we're highly in network and our APV is, in that bottom 10%, I like to say, let's prove to ourselves that we can move that north while we're making preparations to do it, but before we just drop.
Right.
And once we have proof that, yes, we can diagnose, we can present, we can sell, we can deliver more comprehensive dentistry, because you can only do that if you're differentiated to some degree, if the patient actually wants your dentistry. Then that shows us that, lowering your network dependence probably is going to work out.
Yeah. And as you do, let's say you don't do everything. Let's just say over the period of a quarter, you're like, I'm just going to reduce our PPO dependence and just have a few more people every week pay our full fee. You're going to watch that APV go from 644 possibly to 744.
Right.
Then you can start to play with other dials. That's what makes this so cool, is once you know the gaps and you know these numbers, every quarter you can say, let's make an adjustment to that. Let's make an adjustment to that. And ultimately, you're going to watch your overhead go down.
Right.
Don't you think?
Absolutely.
Without paying for cheaper supplies.
Absolutely.
And in some cases, which you presented in our last to the top, your overhead may go up, which means you've made an investment in another team member. You've given raises. You've improved some of this is where it becomes really, really fun.
Yeah, and in a future podcast, we're going to go over this, but don't buy cheaper supplies. Don't buy cheaper printer paper.
Right.
Don't buy cheaper printer toner. Like all these things that all us dentists
I've tried that.
To cut a couple dimes. Don't do that.
You get what you pay for. You're like, this doesn't even fit in the print.
Well, first, it's not going to do any good for your overhead until you know what's your effort gap, how much you're writing off. What's your collections gap? How much should you be collecting? And we have tools that will prove, you'll be able to test whether your high overhead is due to actually spending too much, or is it due to the fact that you have a low profit margin?
Yeah, I love it. Well, wrap this in a bow for us. If I'm listening to this podcast, give us some final thoughts on how important annual patient value is.
Yeah, I want the listeners to just throw out this idea, like I rate myself and my practice based on gross production.
Right.
I want you to just set that aside and say, what's my annual patient value? How efficient am I at getting to that gross production? That is a much more comprehensive, informative story than just gross production. And if you're low, then let's work towards increasing it. Yeah. And if we're high, let's increase it even more, but then start to play that game of, how can I get even more efficient so I can work less? Let's think about our profit margin as if we were a manufacturing company.
Yeah. It's so powerful when you know these things. Now you're not driving blind.
Right.
Have you ever tried to drive your car with snow on the windshield?
Yes.
I feel like that's what some dentists do, is they just keep driving. And they're trying to make a little spot to be able to see.
Yeah.
When you know annual patient value, you know your write-offs, you're driving with a clear line of sight. You know exactly how you're going to get there. You know when you're going to get there. It's a safer drive.
Right.
So I don't even know if that's a good analogy, but it makes sense. It
absolutely is driving blind. And one last thing, because usually at this point in this conversation, which sometimes, as you indicated, can be very money driven.
Right.
And we all have that feeling like, well, but we're taking care of human beings.
Right.
And I want to do good by people. And I will contend that when you know how profitable you are and you're not pressured to do more dentistry, you become even more charitable, because you have more time to help people, spend more time with them, give away more dentistry. You're actually going to do more good in the world by understanding how profitable you are, because now give it away.
100%.
Track it. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I would challenge that the treatment plans and overall outcomes, as your APV goes higher, it's just
way better.
Way better.
Right.
I would imagine your patients know a lot more, value a lot more, and want more of what you can provide.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Good stuff, man.
Awesome.
So if you're struggling with this, the whole idea of this podcast is to give you some things to think about, whether you're on the drive, you're cutting the grass, you're cleaning the garage. I always pick those three. I don't know why. Maybe that's when I listen to podcasts.
That's when I listen to pods. Yeah.
Do you really?
Yeah.
And if you're thinking about this and you need some help, feel free to reach out to us, or you can join us for the To the Top Study Club, which is one of the greatest things that we do. It's a regular study club. We actually have 2 full classes now, and we're adding a 3rd. And we believe in it so much that you can come check it out for free. If you don't like it, you don't have to stay. And if you're watching the video of this podcast, you get a big workbook like this, and we take you through it in the following weeks after the workshop. So we're not going to leave you hanging.
This is like 60 pages, 66, 67 pages long, filled with like amazing stuff.
Step by step by step, how to create a better practice, better life. Thanks for being on, brother.
My pleasure. Can't wait to do it again.
We're going to do it again and again and again. Awesome. So stick around while we say goodbye to everybody else. But thank you guys for listening to the Best Practices Show. Hey, I hope this was helpful. And if it was, do us a favor, just hit the share button, share this with your friends. Keep sending us things that you guys want to see, and we're going to keep lining them up. So until we see you guys next time, or you hear from us next time, keep watching or keep listening to the Best Practices Show. You guys enjoy your day.